My name is Dan Stanton. I am the founder and editor of Bioprocess Insider, part of Bioprocess International. I am honoured and delighted to be chairing the 2 days of the bioLive Theater here, powered by Bioprocess International. And I'm also exceptionally delighted to kick off proceedings with a presentation on, a decade of single use. Really, it's a look at industry's uptake of single-use technology and placing it in context with the forecasting conundrum. And it's coming from my point of view. I am a business journalist. I've never made a monoclonal antibody in my life, and I probably will never do so. But I do get to speak to companies, follow the markets, follow the M&A, the deal making, and everything that goes on. So hopefully this will give a bit of an overview to the state of the industry and where we've come from and hopefully where we're going. So my first slide is actually looking at the demand and supply cycle of manufacturing capacity, and it's actually a slide I stole off Samsung Biologics. They did give me permission to use it. It really kind of shows what the forecasting needs for the industry have been over the past 20 years, in fact. So 20 years ago, almost 2002, what we can see is that the demand for cell culture volume capacity exceeded the supply that was available in the market. So that kind of really has played a part in generating a lot of investment into capacity for the next 2 decades. So 2002, big biologic blockbusters, that's very hard to say, are everywhere. They're starting to emerge, and industry is fairly slow to respond. Demand outstrips capacity. We're in a situation of undercapacity. So what happens over the next few years? Industry invests a hell of a lot of money to build global capacity up and to feed what they think demand needs are going to be. So in 2002, we're roughly at 400,000 litres globally as far as cell culture bioreactor capacity stands. Within 6 years, that has grown to 2.2 million litres, which is a huge amount of investment over that relatively short time period. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. The first one, Genentech, one of the big boys of biopharma. Their Vacaville plant in California, their site there, in 2003, they realized that they are going to need a lot more capacity to feed their pipeline of biologics coming through. So they set aside a great deal of money to build a new facility there, 8 by 25,000 litres, so a 200,000 litre stainless steel facility. That's a real huge investment at the time, and it still would be today. Another example, another company beginning with GEN, but relatively smaller, Genmab, a Danish biotech. A few years later, 2008, they pumped $240 million into a facility in Brooklyn Park, Minnesota, giving them access to in-house manufacturing capabilities. However, a year later, 2009, that dreaded global economic crisis occurred. At the same time, we had some patent cliff issues amongst some of the big biopharmas, and also by 2009, the size of the titers in cell culture had increased fairly dramatically. Meanwhile, M&A had kind of changed the landscape. So Genentech, who we mentioned before, they were acquired by Roche in 2009. Huge mega merger. And the Vacaville plant that they'd invested heavily in was mothballed. It was closed without ever producing any product because the combined network of manufacturing network was just too big for their needs. So at the time, Patrick Yang, the VP of Product Operations at Genentech, said a 6-month delay in having capacity ready for a product can mean a loss of $1 billion a year, whereas having too much capacity costs about 50 to 150 million a year. He was kind of justifying the fact that they mothballed the plant, but it still kind of demonstrates the overcapacity that the 2009 or that period was seeing. Genmab, the other example. they suffered dramatically in the financial crisis, and they were kind of forced to change their strategy. And the plant that they'd bought just the year before had kind of tied up a lot of their capital and weighed their business down. So Jan van der Winkel, who is the current CEO of Genmab, he actually told me last year that the plant was bought in their darkest days. It was bought at a time when there wasn't enough biomanufacturing capacity, and it was very, very costly and inflexible. So what happens next? Well, the next decade, we've seen still overcapacity, as this graph once again shows. I've just zoomed in here, but there is recovery at the end of it, or we're looking towards recovery. So in 2009, 2010, we're really looking at a 50% utilization rate. The kind of optimal level that companies often quote is around 70, 75%, and according to this graph at least, that industry has recovered mostly and it's moving towards that optimal level. So going back to our examples, we're looking at Genentech again. Genentech actually, hooray, reopened the mothballed Vacaville plant because in 2013 they realized that the demand, their capacity needs meant that they needed more in-house capabilities, and there was a mothballed plant and they invested some more money into it and it's operating as it should be today. Genmab, meanwhile, changed their strategy completely. They sold their manufacturing facility to Baxter, who later became Baxalta and then got acquired by Shire, and I believe the plant has been sold again. And they followed a complete outsourcing model, as their CEO says, we like to keep the brains in-house and the hands outside. So talking of outsourcing, the benefits of outsourcing, we're at CPhI, I'm sure there's plenty of CMOs who will tell you it reduces risk, there isn't the need to invest huge amounts of money in your own plant, and it also helps alleviate some of these forecasting concerns that we've seen over the past, over that decade. The situation in biologics, really, we've got a couple of big players, big, large capacities, stainless steel facilities. Really, it's Lonza and Boehringer Ingelheim who have held the majority of the, at least, stainless steel market. Between them, they've got over 1 million litres of stainless steel capacity. They have actually been joined in the last decade by a couple of new players from Korea, the aforementioned Samsung Biologics and Celltrion, who within quite a small area in Songdo Incheon, they're kind of batting towards 500,000 litres of cell culture capacity, and they are apparently going to grow even more. So that's really kind of the stainless steel situation. However, over the past decade, single use has arrived. It's been adopted by industry. Now, we kind of know the pros of single use, the reduction in costs, the reduced energy and the water costs that are associated with single use, the increase in productivity and time saving, the fact that you don't have to shutter the plant to clean. These disposable units also reduce the risk of cross-contamination. And for a facility specifically, implementing single use allows a lot more flexibility, allows multiple products to be made within one facility, and there's a smaller footprint and capital expenditure. So the archetypal example is Amgen. Amgen invested a couple of $100 million, I can't remember the figure exactly, into a plant in Singapore, a next generation facility, which was fully single use, using ballroom suites to manufacture. They claim that it was built in half the construction time at approximately a quarter of the capital cost as a traditional biomanufacturing facility. It's been so successful for them that they actually replicated the model last year when they announced that they were building a similar facility, fully single-use, next-generation technologies in Rhode Island at a cost of $120 million. However, single-use does have its burdens, specifically when we're looking at commercial use. So in the past decade, the industry have really got used to single-use technologies and single-use bioreactors specifically, but we're really kind of still stuck to a certain degree within the clinical space, and we're kind of pushing towards the commercial space for the use of these technologies, but there are hurdles along the way. So probably the largest of these hurdles is the limitation of size. There is a company, ABEC, I believe, who make a 4,000 litre single-use system, but the problem with large, essentially plastic bags filled with cell culture liquids, the pressure of those of a size that big makes it a huge risk, and it makes it you need a lot of infrastructure to ensure that it can cope with the pressure. So really the glass ceiling, or well, the plastic ceiling of single-use technology really stands at 2,000 litres. In the past 10 years, however, there have been some innovations within industry that have been able to manage that limitation. The first one I mentioned before, the higher titers. Back in 2002, titers were well under a gram per litre generally within the industry. We've been moving towards, and surpassing in fact, a double-digit titer, grams per litre. And actually last year, WuXi Biologics announced that using their single-use system, which was actually, I think it was a 4,000 litre bag, run under perfusion, they managed to get a ridiculously large 51 grams per litre titer, which if they can use that for a commercial product, just kind of is incredible. Meanwhile, companies have been using the 2,000 litre limit, but running bioreactors in unison, in configurations. So whereas running a batch at 2,000 obviously has that amount of limit. If you put several bioreactors together, 2, 3, 4, you can get a batch of 4,000 litres, 8,000 litres, you know, it's theoretically endless. And CMC Biologics, who were bought by AGC Biologics, they've really been kind of pushing that model from a CMO point of view. Meanwhile, there's kind of a change in the demands that industry have needed as personalised drugs or orphan disease drugs come into play. Just the sheer volumes for biologic blockbusters aren't quite as necessary as industry thought back in the early 2000s. So really, single use can now become a major tool for commercialization. The safety element of single use, we all know about the problems of extractables and leachables. That's kind of been addressed once again through industry cooperation, and there's a couple of working groups, the BPSA and BPOG, Bioforum Operations Group, who have been working tirelessly with regulators and industry itself and the vendors to produce a set of standards and quality testings. And also the more single use has been used over the past decade, the more confident industry is in using it, especially when it gets towards commercial, late stage and commercial production. Finally, the cost of equipment. This is a bit of a strange one for me because as a journalist, companies do not really like to tell me how much these things cost. But from all I can believe, they are exceptionally expensive when really we're just looking at a plastic bag. However, theoretically, the more industry uses single-use technology, single-use bioreactors, the economies of scale should come into play, and theoretically these systems should get cheaper. I'm not saying they are getting cheaper, but they should do. Meanwhile, the idea of vendor M&A, which I'll get onto in a minute, we've seen some of the vendors move into different areas, and while consolidation really should reduce competition because, hey, that's what evil capitalism does, perhaps there are some opportunities where the use of single use can actually be reduced, the cost of single use can be reduced for the end user, but once again we'll have to see what happens there. So I mentioned CMOs before with Lonza, Boehringer, Ingelheim and the Korean companies and the stainless steel, but single use has really coincided with a growing outsourcing trend in the biomanufacturing space. This is something hopefully we'll be able to discuss more during the panel discussion. But CMOs are really leading the way in adopting single use, and Eric Langer, who is speaking tomorrow from the Bioplan Associates, he's got several reports that show that CMOs, CDMOs are really embracing this technology. And we've seen in the last year, we've seen in the last several years, but in the last year, huge investments by CMOs to broaden out their single-use capabilities, and it's very much specifically single-use. So just to quote myself, which is fairly shameless, Patheon invested 50 million to double their biologics capacity last year. AGC Bio, who I mentioned before, added another 12,000 litres of single-use technology in a plant in Denmark. Catalent, who they've been building up their biologics capacity, have invested further into single-use systems. And then Wuxi Biologics, who once again I mentioned earlier, they have dramatically jumped into this space by going from 0 to 220,000 litres of solely single-use capacity within a 10-year period. Or they will do once the plant's open the next year or two. So at the same time, what's happening with the single-use vendors? Well, this exceptionally messy slide, which kind of looks like some of the sponsors at a typical Bioprocess International show, shows on the left-hand side a lot of the vendors that were kind of hanging out in the space a decade ago. The ones on the right-hand side were hanging around on a decade ago, but they still exist pretty much in that form or a inflated form today. So that was 10 years ago. Today, there is still a lot of small companies around, but really, we're dominated by 4 companies themselves who have invested heavily in their single-use capabilities through essentially M&A. So Merck, Germany's Merck, they acquired Millipore in 2010 for $7 billion, and then 5 years later spent another $17 billion acquiring Sigma-Aldrich. Millipore Sigma now is a huge bioprocessing vendor. Thermo Fisher, they've made all sorts of investments, just a couple of M&A activities that they've done in the last 10 years. Life Technologies was 13.6 billion. I think it was one of the largest at the time. ASI I mentioned because they were a pure play single-use bioreactor company, and they have absorbed them and consolidated the market further. Danaher, who is relatively new to the bioprocessing space, they bought Paul Life Sciences in 2015 for 14 billion or close enough. And GE Healthcare, they announced a couple of years ago, GE Healthcare, who would have been on this slide if I was presenting 3 months ago, they have put in a 21.4 billion bid that should close by the end of the year. So you've got Danaher as a major player within the single-use vendors as well. And then finally, Sartorius. Sartorius, we haven't seen the large mergers and acquisitions that some of the other players have produced, but they've been constantly buying companies up, TAP Biosystems, Allpure, for example, and they're really one of the big 4 players here. Other M&A activity continues. Repligen's just bought another company today, not specifically in single use, but to build out their capabilities. But another area which I'd like to bring up very quickly is Patheon. Thermo Fisher moved away from, they moved into a new direction, shall I say, in 2017 when they bought Patheon for $7 billion. It was kind of the first time I can think of a vendor buying a CDMO. Since then, they've actually put in a bid for Brammer Bio for 1.7 billion, another CMO, but a CMO that's focused more on the gene therapy space, which kind of brings up the question of, are there synergies between the single-use technologies and equipment at Thermo Fisher and the CMOs that they effectively own and operate now, and whether those cost savings that should occur get passed on to the end user or not. And that relates back to the slide I mentioned before about, are these systems are the cost of these systems reducing or not? So, my final slide, we're going to have a look beyond 2020, and as the final part of that initial graph shows, the demand and supply graph there's a lot of uncertainty. As new modalities come into play, are we going to need reduced capacity because some of these are curative, they don't rely on a regular regimen, so the volumes are required are reduced. Are they going to need new technologies altogether? Are there going to be new blockbusters? Theoretically, companies are pumping a lot of money into R&D for drugs to combat diseases with huge potential patient populations, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, cancer, and if so, we're going to need a lot of capacity to feed that demand if they become successful. So really, what's going to happen over the next few years, as far as forecasting goes, it's uncertain. However, the single-use element of it means that industry can be a lot more responsive to the needs. CMOs can enter this space and take up a large amount of market share because they can invest in doubling, trebling their facilities at a reduced cost and have that volume available for industry to use. And then there's the hybrid model, which a lot of the big biopharma companies are really advocating, where there's stainless steel and single use, and there's kind of a flexible approach to biomanufacturing. The CMO engagement, as I mentioned, CMOs aren't going away from the space, they're only going to get bigger. And then the vendor consolidations. I don't know if Danaher or Merck are going to follow the Thermo Fisher model and acquire a contract manufacturer or such. But if they do, there's that broadened service and where the synergies can play between the technology side of things and the manufacturing side of things. And on that note, I would just like to say thank you so much for listening to my presentation. If there are any very, very quick questions, I will take them. There's a hand up straight away. Yep, go for it.
Chuck.
I think it was does that chart
include both single use and stainless, or is it just stainless?
I don't think it does, to be honest. I think it's really looking at. The initial chart. It's. Let me get back to it. Yeah, I believe it does show total capacity, but I need to double check that, so don't take my word for it. But like I said, I was gifted this chart by Samsung Biologics, who obviously have an interest in stainless steel capacity, but I believe they took their data from either global data or Evaluate. I would need to double check on that one. Okay, and I'm going to be presenting the panel discussion, but we have a couple of speakers before that. I'd just like to say thank you very much for listening to me, and I would like to introduce Scott Patterson, the Vice President of Commercial Sales at ILC Dover, who will be talking about single-use technology for containment during ADC handling. Thank you.